Good evening. It is good to be with you again. This evening, we're continuing our series on renewal, turning over a new leaf in the pages of history. And we've come to the subject of Israel, a new land. Having considered how God made a new start after the worldwide flood, which we considered last week, we now look at the next turning point in God's dealings with mankind, his new start with the people of Israel. We will review how the Jews have experienced many new starts during their long national life. We will find that it will be a history of success and then failure, new leaves turned, new starts that appeared to be successful, only to end in disaster. But eventually, the Bible tells us, there is a happy ending. So let's go back to the start. After the recolonization of the earth after the flood, God, seeing that one of Noah's descendants, Abraham, was a God-fearing man, he chose him to be the father of God's own people. He promised Abraham that his many descendants would become a great nation, living in a land God would give them. The land they then called Canaan, but is now occupied by modern Israel. Abraham's descendants settled in Canaan, but a severe famine caused them to migrate down to Egypt. There they prospered, and over the next few hundred years became so numerous that the Egyptian pharaohs saw them as a threat to Egypt's national security. The Egyptians' response was to enslave the Israelites, as they were called by that time, making their lives absolutely intolerable by a most cruel and sadistic oppression. Certainly, Israel were in desperate need of a new beginning. But as we suggested, this was no ordinary nation. They were God's people. He said of them, "You only have I known of all the families of the earth." So God sent a devastating series of plagues on the Egyptians, so that after an initial resistance, they were compelled to let Israel go. Thus, all Israel set out for their new land and a new life under the leadership of Moses. A few weeks after leaving Egypt, they encamped at the foot of Mount Sinai. There, a wonderful thing happened. In a great display of thunder, lightning, and fiery clouds, God descended on the top of the mountain. And God then welded this group of former one-time slaves into a nation. He spoke to them, gave them a legal system that would govern their national life. Israel, understandably, trembled at this direct intervention by God, but they promised absolute obedience to what God had asked. All that the Lord has spoken, we would obey, they said. As a result, God said he would dwell among them, provided they kept their word to be obedient. Excuse me. They then sent out for the land God had promised them. When they arrived in Canaan, because God was with them, they were able to expel the evil nations that already were there and to take over the land. So here indeed was a new beginning for this young nation. But after this good start in a new land, things went sadly wrong. Despite their promise of absolute obedience to God, they turned to idolatry, worshipping the false gods of the surrounding nations. And that was the one thing that God hated and had forbidden. So God allowed the surrounding nations to come and dominate them. Time and again, after suffering at the invaders' hands, they repented, but then they relapsed and went back to those earlier ways. After a few hundred years, God allowed them to appoint a king in an attempt to unite the nation. So here, with a monarchy, was another new beginning, and it marked the golden age of Israel's history. Under the valiant King David and his wise son Solomon, the nation became more prosperous, extended its boundaries, set up a system of government with God at the forefront. Jerusalem became its capital city, and a wonderful temple was built there in which God said he would dwell, provided that Israel was obedient to his laws. But sadly, the old pattern repeated itself. After a period of prosperity, due to their obedience to God, the nation went through the same cycle of forsaking God, then returning to him, then falling away again. God sent his prophets to point out their errors and to reform them. But in general, these attempts were ignored. So God again punished them, allowing this time some northern hostile nations, first Assyria and then Babylon, to invade them. And they came and devastated the cities of Israel, destroyed the Jerusalem temple and the city. And as was the custom in those days, they carried off the Jews into captivity. Thus ended the tenure of Israel as an independent kingdom in their land, the land that God had promised them. But this was not to last forever, because God was very merciful to his people. And after a 70-year period of exile, he allowed them to return to their previous land and to resettle it, no longer independent, but as a subject people in a land that they once owned, but nevertheless they were there. So here was another new start. And they set to work rebuilding Jerusalem, rebuilding the temple. During the next 500 years, they showed that they had learned the earlier lesson, and they never again reverted to idolatry. But this new start again ended in failure. By the time Jesus was born, several hundred years after, the worship had become perfunctory. And when Jesus came to them preaching the true worship of God, they rejected him, and after a mock trial, crucified the Son of God himself. Jesus, in his preaching, had foreseen that this would happen, and also the divine punishment that the Jews would now deserve and would have. He predicted some terrible events that were before the nation. Jerusalem would again be devastated by an invader. This time it would be the Romans. Jerusalem would be ravaged, the people destroyed, and the whole nation again taken into captivity. This is what Jesus had foretold. For days shall come upon you, that's Jerusalem, when your enemies will build an embankment about you, enclose you in on every side, and leave not one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. There will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people, and they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations. In the year AD 70, Christ's predictions were completely fulfilled. The Roman armies came, and after an indescribable, terrible siege, destroyed Jerusalem and its temple, and deported the Jews into slavery throughout the empire. So another possession of their land came to an end. But despite that national dispersion, which has lasted for centuries now, God said that one day they would return to the original territory he had promised them. And this is what the prophet Ezekiel told them. For I will take you from among the nations and gather you out of all countries and bring you into your own land. And in comparatively recent years, this has now happened. After centuries of dispersion throughout the world, the Jews are back to their old land. This time, God says, to eventually enjoy permanent prosperity and peace. But this will not be by their own efforts, but by the return of Jesus to the earth, just as he promised that he would. Israel will then acknowledge the returned Jesus as their long-promised Messiah, submit to his rule, and become the premier nation in the worldwide kingdom that Jesus will set up. So for Israel, this last new beginning will be the very final one, and they will go forward into the kingdom of God as the head of the nations, we're told, and not the tail. Well, what does this mean for us? Well, there are several things that come out of this study. It tells us that God is in absolute control of world events. What he predicted, whether it was good or bad, would actually come to pass. And that's something we can be assured of, that God is controlling the world today. It also tells us of God's mercy and compassion to those who fall, as Israel frequently did. Excuse me. Also, just as God chose the nation of Israel as his own people in the past, so he has chosen individuals as well as a nation, and is still doing so today. The Apostle Paul wrote to some Christians in his day, God has chosen you from the foundation of the world. Think of that. God chooses from the foundation of the world the people he eventually wants to be his children. But like Israel in the past, God has given those children rules to govern their lives. Keep those rules, and God will bring us into his promised land. That is the worldwide kingdom of God that the returned Jesus will establish on the ruins of the present disastrous human rule. Well, that is the ups and downs of the history of Israel, various leaves that were turned over in the history book of that nation. So for us, may each of us learn the lessons that this history of Israel teaches us, so that when the kingdom of God is established on earth, we may be invited into it. Thank you very much.